Hi, Anthony. Thanks so much for having me on. It's exciting to see in the chat people all over the place who are tuning into this. Just say to everyone at the outset, I'm grateful for your interest in this book that my wife and I wrote a few years ago.
Great. So as I mentioned, it's a sort of a very broad book, covers um, philosophy, politics, religion. So restlessness is this kind of core idea which you see as having many different tributaries that it generates. So I guess we'll just start in the classic philosophical way with some basic definitions. So what is restlessness, and is there any interesting stories to be told about its etymology or the different
Mm,
words people use in different cultural contexts?
mm.
Any kind of general reflections on the concept itself?
Yeah, so the restlessness, the English word that we use, is a translation of the French word inquiétude, which could be translated as disquiet, the being ill at ease. Um, and I think the interest in this term, or the definition of the term, which is really what you asked about, I think we get it best from Blaise Pascal, the second thinker that we deal with in this book, who said that the source of all the trouble of human life is that human beings can't sit alone in a room. And this is, I think this is a widespread, powerful experience. It's an experience you can locate in many places all across time. I think it's particularly, in some ways, particularly acute for us, something that we all can notice uh, in a kind of ongoing and insistent way, in the sense that so many of us have such a hard time doing things like putting aside our digital distractions so as to pay attention to the stuff that we really care about. And so we'll sit there and we'll be bored for a moment, and we'll find ourselves scrolling through things and so on and so forth. And we will afterwards say to ourselves, why did I do that? Why am I wasting my life in this way? And I think what the concept of restlessness does when it that is helpful for understanding this is it shows us that the flight into diversion, that's another these crucial Pascalian and Montaigne terms that helps us understand all this. The flight in the diversion into diversion is less a seeking for something than a running from something. And the thing from which we are running is this disquietude, this restlessness, which haunts us whenever we find ourselves alone in silence and facing up to our own thoughts and the things that we know about ourselves and the things that we fear and dislike about ourselves.
Sorry, I put my audio back on. Sorry, that was great. I guess so restlessness, I suppose, would be seen as a subcategory of anxiety, perhaps. Anxiety
Hmm.
may be the more broad spectrum term, and restlessness is perhaps a particular form of
Hmm.
anxiety. I don't know if you agree with that, but I suppose it could also be something associated with excitement. Like if I had 2 hours before a Taylor Swift concert or whatever it was I was going to, I may be extremely restless, but it wouldn't be necessarily a negative thing. It would be part of excitement. But I think the restlessness you're focusing on is primarily linked with anxiety. It would be part of that broader category.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
guess
Anthony,
also
just
perhaps with boredom as well, which is not quite
yeah.
anxiety. This is a sort of Heidegger thing. He focuses on anxiety and boredom as these kind of fundamental moods. And I think restlessness can definitely come out of boredom, which may also be part of anxiety, maybe different. I'm
Yeah.
not sure how you see restlessness as fitting into a broader category like anxiety, for example.
I'm struck by your waiting for the Taylor Swift concert example. I think the interesting thing about that is you're you're pepped up in a certain sense, but you're focused, right? There's a certain thing that's going to happen, and you're very fixated on that thing. And I think the connection between restlessness and boredom is another one that is illustrative of the kind of phenomena that we're trying to get at. There's a wonderful passage, or just I think I heard this in an interview with the disturbing but always very revealing French novelist Michel Houellebecq, which who I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar. And Houellebecq, in describing his own writing process, he describes what it means to sort of find inspiration. He says, you sit there and on s'ennuie un peu, you get a little bored and il vient and it comes, right? And I think, and I think, particularly for somebody like me who spends most of his time writing, the boredom is extremely important, right? You have to sit there and live with it. Because that's when the thing comes. But it's very hard to do that. And it's particularly hard to do that if you're writing at a computer, which is connected to everything. Whenever you're bored, you could just you could watch sports, you could check into the news, you could Google yourself, you could do whatever you want. And it is but that the silence creates the space of genuine thought. And so that's one of the deeper phenomena about this is that my wife and I are working on another book right now. And it's called The Art of Choosing, and it's actually an extension of, in some ways, the conclusion of this book. And one of the contentions of this new book that we're working on is that action is not really free if it doesn't begin from thought. That is, if we don't, if the choices that we make are not deeply reflective, if they are not the product of some sort of creative cogitation of ours, they're just reactive. We're just responding to circumstances. And so our restlessness, our tendency to distract ourselves, to plunge ourselves into distraction, deprives us of the quiet in which we do the genuine thinking that is real human creativity, real freedom, but real painful at times, but nonetheless absolutely essential to living the kind of lives I think many of us want to live. And so, in that sense, I think those cognates are these related terms are interesting. Anthony, I confess that I have not thought through the relationship of anxiety and restlessness all that well. If you've got more to say about anxiety, maybe I could try to fit the my understanding of restlessness into it. But I don't know that this is, I don't have a ready conception of the relation among the terms.
Yeah, I don't think it's especially important. I mean, I think that the angle of your book was definitely restlessness as problematic. So I
Yeah,
suppose it's probably closer to anxiety than to excitement, for example.
yeah,
But I was kind of going a little bit down a classic sort of philosophical dead end, really, of just trying to kind of get deeper into kind of conceptual analysis or definition. So I guess the next question I would have is about how wide-ranging it can be. So, for example,
yeah.
your focus is on modern America, but the four thinkers you use in your book, Montaigne, Pascal, Rousseau, and Tocqueville, are all French thinkers ranging across a few centuries. So, do you see restlessness as having vastly different manifestations across
Mm.
time, across cultures, or are there certain sort of core features that seem fairly stable over historical accounts of it?
Yeah, that's I think there's lots of indications that there's something stable and that transcends a lot of history here. So, for example, we quoted the line in the book, the famous remark of Saint Augustine on the first page of the Confessions, that our hearts are restless until they, he's speaking to God. He says our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so, in this sense, there is something here that is really fundamental. But the thing that really was, I would say, the germ of this book was that was the oscillation of the back and forth that my wife and I experienced as teachers between our students and the conversations that we were having with them on the one hand, and the books that we're reading on the other. And so, we begin the book with some observations about about some really wonderful students that we had, and you know we're focused here on the crème de la crème, the kids who are doing everything that the college that where we taught that they were doing everything that the college asked of them and then some. So they were, you know, in multiple majors. They were hitting it out of the park. And pardon the American baseball metaphors. They were doing you know, they were doing really well in all of their studies. They were very active in the social world. They were, you know, they were founding clubs and serving in service organizations. They were going on study abroads. They were, you know, doing their internships. They were doing all kinds of stuff. And when these very same students, you know, you know, they wrote wonderful papers. They were great to have in class. They were really bright kids. These very same students would approach graduation, which confronted them with, I don't know how this compares to other societies, but in America, graduating from college is in some ways the first real choice you make in your life. The or confronts you with the first real choice you make in your life. College, because we're so focused on the liberal arts tradition over here, college is still wide open, right? You go to college, you study for 4 years, you can go off do whatever you want. But that first step out of college, then that is a definition. You have to say, you can't just say yes to things. You have to start saying no to things. And the interesting things that we saw in our students was that their educations didn't seem to prepare them for this at all. It seemed to just leave them utterly unstrung by the prospect of what to do next. And so that was the phenomena of restlessness as we saw it in our students. And we got the word for what we were seeing in them from the books that we were reading, and in particular Alexis de Tocqueville. And you know, Alexis de Tocqueville's, you know, he's this famous, wonderful chapter on restlessness in the second volume of Democracy in America. So this French thinker, he comes to the United States, he meets these Americans. He's like, these people in general have it really good, right? They are extraordinarily enlightened. This country is you know, rising in prosperity. They have this wide open freedom with which to choose what to do with themselves, and they can't sit still. They bounce from one thing to the next. From here to there. They move all over the country. They change careers all the time. He's got this great line where he describes how an American builds a house in which to retire, and he sells it when the roof is being laid. And this really resonated with my wife and I because we bought a house and we had to have it re-roofed, and right after it was re-roofed, we sold it. Because like you get, sitting there and being content is just a profoundly un-American thing to do. And so we were, you know, this is what got us. This is what got us wondering, you know, Tocqueville was able to observe this, which you just don't find much in American writings about Americans themselves. It's a kind of thing that is very deep in us, but that we have a hard time seeing, perhaps for precisely that reason, that it is so ubiquitous. So Tocqueville was able to see this, I think, in part because he's coming out of this great French tradition that really meditates on this. And so Tocqueville is, he's said to have read three philosophers every day, and those three philosophers are Montesquieu, Pascal, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I think it is particularly the Pascalian dimension of Tocqueville that allowed him to get a hold of this, because of that Pascalian observation that the reason that human beings are unhappy is because they can't sit alone in a room. And we thought that that Pascalian observation had something to do with Pascal's great predecessor, not as prominent directly in the mind of Tocqueville, Michel de Montaigne, and his conception of what it means for a human being to seek happiness. And so that's something of the way at which we got at this problem.
Brilliant. I mean, yeah, you've got the four chapters on the four thinkers. I think probably we won't touch much on Rousseau today. I mean, it's a very interesting chapter, but I think the sort of the key drama of the book revolves around Montaigne and Pascal. So broadly speaking, I suppose it's fair to say that Montaigne is kind of the affable or benevolent baddie in the book, and Pascal is the sort of spiky or provocative hero of your book. And I guess we could, I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I guess we could maybe unpack the sort of
Mhm.
contrast. So I suppose the main contrast is between um, immanence and transcendence, which is a sort of big philosophical idea. So I guess we'll have to get into that. And Montaigne is your kind of practitioner of immanence, and specifically what you call immanent contentment. So perhaps you could give us a sense of what Montaigne's project is, and
Mhm.
then maybe some of the tensions you find in it that Pascal kind of really blows open when he analyzes it.
Yeah, the so I think you've characterized this nicely, but also provocatively, and I just want to deal a little bit with this characterization of Montaigne as the villain, the or the benevolent villain, and the and Pascal as the spiky sort of hero of the book. The I think that's basically accurate, but I but I think it's important to specify the following. I wrote my dissertation about Michel de Montaigne, and I have a deep and abiding love of this thinker. He is the person. Uh, I was simply entranced by the prose of this book. It introduced me to France. I encountered this my first year of graduate school. I had no intention of studying French things. I didn't speak the French language. I had never been to France. None of it. And I encountered Montaigne and a great teacher of Montaigne, and it turned my life around. And I really sought to live a Montaignean life in some ways for a whole period of years. With respect to Pascal, I encountered him just a year or two later, and I hated the guy. The In fact, somebody just tried to, a senior faculty member on my graduate committee tried to compel me to read Pascal as part of my graduate studies, and I was willing at first, and I picked up some Pascal and I started to read it, and I read 100 pages, and I hated it so much that I literally threw the book across the room. And I fought that guy to keep Pascal out of the purview of my studies, and I won. the and so in a certain sense, I began with a love of Montaigne and a hatred of Pascal so far that it became a rejection, and about a decade later, that all reversed. And that is part of that's one of the deep interests for me of writing this book is working through the sense of my own thought about this. um so let me start with doing what you asked for, which is giving an account of Montaigne's project and what is attractive, I think, about that project. The Montaigne, what one always has to begin from where he began, which is the year in which he began writing this wonderful book, the Essays. And so that book is Montaigne is the first person to use essay as a noun that refers to a piece of writing. The He began writing this book in the year 1572, and that is a momentous year. It's the year of the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. That is the lowest point in the French wars of religion. And so France has these terribly nasty three-way wars of religion between a Protestant faction, an ultra-Catholic faction, and the kind of weak-kneed but sometimes brutal monarchy sort of caught between the two. And and Montaigne looks at all this, and he says it's really, he says literally, it's putting a very high price upon one's opinions, the to have one's neighbor roasted alive because of them. The And that was not metaphorical. The When he was describing this, he witnessed some really terrible things in the course of his life concerning what could be some pretty arcane seeming quarrels about the transcendent. And so human beings, so for example, he has this great line, that human beings are willing to kill one another over the meaning of the syllable hoc. And that's the Latin word for this, as in, this is my body, which priests say every time they raise the host at the mass. And the Protestant Catholic argument is in some ways about whether that is meant literally or figurative. Yeah. And Montaigne is looking around going like, wait a minute. Did you kill like 30,000 people over this? This is nuts. And so he starts, the interesting thing is that he starts down a road of thought because of that immediate historical experience. But being who he is, being a man who had like he just imbibed the whole classical and Christian tradition. He has all this stuff. It's funny. He complains about having a bad memory, which is frankly nonsense. He had a wonderful memory. As you can tell when you're reading through this book, because he's got all this stuff just at his fingertips. Like when he's going to think one of his own thoughts, and a line of Ovid just pops into his head. And next thing you know, it's on the page, and that is the way of Montaigne. So when he goes and he observes this terrible phenomenon of his own time, and he looks back to the philosophic and religious tradition from which he draws. He says, what is this about? He says, human beings are constantly arguing over the question of the summum bonum, of the highest good, of what will really make a human being happy, of what is the one thing needful, or the pearl of great price in Christian language. And and he says in response to that, like, look, maybe this whole inquiry is just fundamentally misguided. Maybe we cannot figure out what the pearl of great price is. Maybe we can't find the one thing needful. Maybe we can't answer the question of whether a human being really ought to pattern him or herself after the model of a hero, or the model of a philosopher, the model of a saint. Maybe we just don't know, and we never will. And maybe the right way to live in response to that fact is to say, like, instead of investigating the question of the highest good, let's look around at all the goods that attract human beings. So human beings are interested in travel, like explorers are, or pilgrims are. They're interested in wisdom, like philosophers or scholars. They're interested in sex and love, and they're interested in food, and they're interested in politics, and they're interested in all this stuff. Montaigne says maybe the right way to live is just to take some of all of it, them to dabble one's way to happiness, to do a little bit of this, to do a little bit of that, to have nothing too much, as the ancient philosophic adage has it, but also nothing too little. The Not to ignore any of the parts of human life. And maybe if we reconceive of ourselves and our world in that way, we can find a mode of happiness that doesn't get involved in those lofty questions of the highest good that somehow are seem almost inevitably bound up in bloodshed. The And we can make ourselves happy in a way that has a sort of lower temperature than the usual modes of the human pursuit of this. And so that's what we think of as Montaigne's quest for immanent contentment is, I'm going to try to make myself happy by taming my own desire to find some one great thing, like the Taylor Swift concert, that will miraculously transform me into a transcendent being that will leave all the discontents of human life behind. Instead, I'm just going to take the goods as they're given, enjoy them for what they are, without asking them to be more than they are. And that for him is the secret to happiness. And that version of happiness is what we call immanent contentment.
Thanks. That's a very thorough answer. I suppose that I mean part of what you note is that temperamentally or philosophically really Montaigne is a skeptic. Like that's the tradition. So he's not really the sort of spirit of his thing is to embrace everything, not to get too hung up on whether something's true or not. And that obviously has a sort of a spirit of generosity, of kind of like opening to different cultures, different ways of being. And I think that spirit very much imbues the modern world. So I guess that's part of the link you would make between Montaigne and the contemporary world. So to come to your student on the cusp of making a big decision, I mean, you frame it as kind of law school or PhD as
Yeah.
the sort of dilemma. Like, what would a kind of a immersion in how would a Montaignean immersion kind of make the kind of choices that you describe more difficult? Or how would it set the
Mm.
scene for this restlessness or this lack of
Mm.
direction over how to choose one
Ah,
thing over another, more of a
uh,
likely phenomenon?
that's actually a very helpful way, I think, to get at this. Um, so what you see when you encounter a student on the cusp of these kinds of choices is, if I can move into our next thinker for a moment, if I move into Blaise Pascal, I've come to think that the most important sentence in Pascal, or most of the most important sentences in Pascal, are approximately 3 words long. And one of them is uh, Vous êtes embarqué. You're embarked. And I think what Pascal means by that is like you are like a person who's embarked on a ship, the ship of your life. In other words, you're moving downstream. And that motion, that fundamental forward motion, is not a thing that you can arrest. You're moving with the force of the current. You're moving through time. And you have choices along the way. You can go down this branch of the river, you can turn into a port, you can make various navigational decisions about this. But what you can't do is sit still or go backward. You're moving. And so the difficulty, and in other words, you're choosing a finite course of life. And you don't get to not do that. The This is this is what. So, for example, say you want to hold back, you just want to contemplate various ways of life and so on and so forth. Well, what are you doing? And let's say you decide to do that. Let's say you decide to undertake a year's course of study, and then what you're going to read Saint Augustine, and you're going to read the Quran, and you're going to read the Bhagavad Gita, and you're going to read Spinoza and Nietzsche and all kinds of stuff. Give it 2 years. The You have just what are you doing? Okay, and in a certain sense, you're holding back from the question of how you're going to spend your life. But in another sense, you are spending your life, right? You're deciding, what is your life? Your life is in some ways your time, right? I am going to spend 2 years of my time engaged in this activity and therefore not engaged in other activities. So I can't have a high pressure job in finance while I'm doing this. I can't be in medical school while I'm doing this because it takes the fullness of my attention. And so that is that is the problem, I think, of the dabbling Montaignean vision of happiness, is that it doesn't uh, confront or teach us to deal with or help us deal with the fact that we have to say yes to this and no to that. And particularly the latter part is really hard for us. And that's why we concentrated on decisions like law school or PhD, right, is by definition a privileged decision, right? Like if you're lucky enough to be facing that, well, you're a pretty lucky person. And that's entirely true. And I think that's where we see this most closely, right? Because people at the peaks of our socioeconomic order who have choices like that, the preoccupations of those kinds of people, the way in which they are discontent, I think are exceedingly revealing, right? Because in some ways, everybody else sort of struggling through the modern pyramid is, in a sense, aspiring to be like that. But if you get to these places where you have lots of options, right? And lots of people in the modern world are always celebrating having options. Won't that be great? Well, you know, if you have no way to choose among the options, maybe it's not that great. And I think that's what a lot of people really experience is, you were just thrown again and again into the position of having to sort of give an account of your entire life from scratch, which is very tough for a lot of us to do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, the sort of choice you noted sort of reminded me of a very different famous choice in the philosophical literature.
Hmm.
Sartre's one about the person who says, "What should I do? Should I go and fight for the resistance against the Nazis in France, or should I care for my um, infirm, my unwell mother?" And I guess that's a classic example of a what he considers a choice with no obvious way to kind of resolve it. So I suppose there is always this sense that some choices are not going to be fully
Mm.
they're not
Yeah,
going to be fully rational choices. You could sort of weigh it up according to different moral categories, but in the end, I think Sartre's point is you've just got to jump in. But to come back to the bit that we haven't really talked about, which is in many ways the sort of one of the core lessons of your book, it's this idea of transcendence. So in
mm,
Montaigne's world, we have this focus on immanence. I mean, even the world of religion, Montaigne sort of takes with a pinch of salt. He continues to be a Catholic because it's kind of what is done in his society, and he just sort of carries on. He knows that if he lived in Southeast Asia, he'd probably be a Buddhist or whatever that. But
exactly.
for Pascal, it sort of does reintroduce in a sort of an important way the problem of what happens if you cut off the transcendent element. So Pascal's diagnosis, whereas Montaigne seems to be suggesting that in this immanent realm we can calm our passions, enjoy what we enjoy, try to sort of understand death in such a way as to fear it less, and life is good. Pascal says that this, in fact, um, kind of cuts us off from a extremely important part of our life, and that actually what it serves to do is make our restlessness more toxic. So his
Hmm.
kind of diagnosis was that most of the people that followed Montaigne and tried to live a Montaignean life, which I suppose you'd call quite a sort of privileged, quasi-aristocratic way of living, were in fact secretly restless. Perhaps perhaps they were suffering from ennui, which is sort of maybe a sort of a, as you said, a related word to inquiétude, and that as a result, this was a failed project. And that seems to be a thought that you take very seriously. So could you talk a little bit about what are we trying to
Hmm.
transcend, I suppose, would be the
Yeah,
transcendence implies something we're moving beyond. So what is transcendence in your account?
that's a you were putting this so sharply. There's a there's a great the other great three word sentence in Pascal that I was thinking of is as superlatively important. It's actually only two words. It's just one of them is repeated. He says, "L'homme dépasse l'homme. Man transcends man." Or it's actually just "L'homme passe l'homme." I think it's the French original of this sentence. And so I think what Pascal is doing is he is a guy who sort of is raised in a Montaignean world, and he is an utterly extraordinary guy. In other words, like, look, everybody we write about in this book is an astonishing person. Like, Montaigne like invents the essay, and like it's really kind of the one of a few fountainheads of like all of French literature and modern philosophy. It's a pretty significant role that he has. Rousseau writes like novels and operas at the same time. He's also a pretty remarkable figure. But Pascal will just take your breath away. He is there are only a few thinkers ever like this. I mean, the only one I can really compare him to is Aristotle, because like this is a world-class genius in like his mathematical works like stand the test of time. People still read his work on conic sections because because it was absolutely crucial to the development of mathematics. His work in physics, the like he's the guy who discovered that nature does not in fact abhor a vacuum. And so to this day, units of pressure are called pascals. He invents one of the world's first working calculators. He comes up with one of the world's first public transportation systems. He's engaged in this incredible literary sort of dagger fight with his provincial letters against the Jesuits, who were like the most powerful churchmen of his time. And then he writes this incredible religious apologetic work, which is the Pensée, which is the thing that we're really concentrated on in this book. And so this is an absolutely incandescent mind, who does like who just like does things that resonate all down through history and dies at 39, despite the fact that he's like sick and suffering for about the last decade of his life, which is also his most productive period. So this is just an astonishingly incandescent kind of soul. And so I'm a great admirer of Pascal. And it is he is in some ways my favorite author, and the person who speaks most deeply to me. But but I'm certainly not like Pascal, and I don't really know anybody who is, because, like, most minds just don't burn anywhere nearly that hot. So, but what Pascal sees through that incredible intensity of his is, he's hanging out with people who are living Montaigne lives, and they're charming lives. They're wealthy, they're sophisticated, they have great parties. It's all going very nicely. But Pascal looks at this and he says, "No, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. These people are diverting themselves, and for them, diversion meant like going to the hunting lodge and chasing boars through the forests, or the doing sophisticated things in the salons of Paris and flirting and having affairs and blah blah blah. The For us, it's much more like the internet. The Nonetheless, the fundamental phenomena at bottom is the same. And what's at bottom the same? And this is getting to your question, Anthony, which is what are we trying to transcend? What we're trying to transcend, or what Pascal thinks we have to understand is oriented toward transcending, that we actually need to transcend, is the honest experience of the human condition, which is what we get when we sit alone in a room with ourselves. Because, he asks after he writes that famous sentence about not being able to sit alone in a room, he says, why? Why can't we do this? He says, because of what we see when we sit alone in a room, which is that we want knowledge, we get ignorance. We want to be virtuous, and we know that we're vicious. We want life, we get death. We want happiness, we get sadness. That is who we are on Pascal's understanding. And we have to face up to this fact about ourselves. And when we do, it launches us on a quest, right? We're like, oh my heavens, I am a question. Pascal says I'm a monster, right? Like I am not a natural being. I cannot understand myself in those terms. I am crazy would not be an inaccurate way to say what Pascal is saying. Not because I'm an abnormal human being, because I am a normal human being. Craziness is the normal human condition on Pascal's understanding. If I really start to live with that, then I know that I am in a quest for something very strange, something that I cannot give myself, something that I cannot find among any of the goods of this world. And Pascal thinks that's what human life is really about. And that's what his pensée is about, is the attempt to live with that restless search for what might be an answer to the extremely strange question that the human soul is asking.
Oh, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, the interesting thing is, the impression I got from your book is that Pascal was immersed in a sort of a Montaignean world, so he felt the need to challenge that. And one of the things you diagnose is that, I mean, I guess we'll just go with contemporary America because that's the focus of your book, is also a world that you feel is dedicated towards denying unhappiness. So could you say
Mm,
something about um,
yeah,
I guess if there's, for example, you may frame it around Enlightenment optimism, about the idea of progress, about maybe humans finding the idea of sin as an idea somewhat antiquated or undesirable to think it through. So either way, you certainly see a society that seems dedicated to ignoring this kind of side of itself. So could
yeah.
you comment on this process and how
Sh-
it's arisen?
Sure. The phrase that we found ourselves using for this in the book was um, that we seem to be driven toward happiness signaling, right? Instead of virtue signaling, we do that too. But we want to project to everyone a picture of ourselves as living a contented, awesome, fantastic, enviable life. So we see this obviously in social media, but I think all of us are doing it in much more subtle face-to-face ways all the time. And I really caught on to the the um the difficulty that this presents, the discomfort that a lot of people feel with it in teaching Pascal, because Pascal would just say to people like, we're miserable. Like, he says like human beings are great and they are miserable. Their greatness and their misery are bound up with one another. But I want to it's important to talk about the greatness too, but I want to put the accent on the misery for a minute. Just like people are just, they're just profoundly unhappy. The vast majority of the time, and I would teach this to students, and they were like, no one has ever said This is the thing precisely that no one has ever said. And I mean, like, look, when you spend a lot of time around, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but at least, American young people between the ages of 18 and 22, they're having a hard time. All these terrible statistics, suicide rate, and eventual low rates of marriage, the incidence of self-harm and all this kind of stuff. People are just not doing well. And to find somebody in the great tradition of philosophy who says, uh-huh, yep, I understand that. Yep. In fact, that's what everybody's like. And like, okay, now you've gotten to thing one. And now we have to work forward. From this place of real desperation. But the facing up to this kind of desperation uh is the start. Is the it's Pascal says there are only three kinds of people. There are people who haven't found God and aren't seeking him. There are people who have found God and are living a charitable life, and there are people who haven't found God but are seeking him. And the whole goal of his book is to move us from people who aren't looking to people who are looking. And, and that's all he thinks he can do. And he doesn't think that's going to make us happy, right? He doesn't think the search is going to be the solution, but he thinks of what he can do, because that's what it means to be embarked on a genuinely religious quest, is to know that you're asking a question which you cannot answer for yourself, and that no human being can answer for you, right? You are hoping that God is a person that might actually have something to say to you, might actually care about you, might actually even love you. And that's what Pascal wants to see, that longing is in us, get us to deal with it, get us to face up to it, and then start to try to act on it insofar as we can, by trying to live a holier life, and also by actually welcoming. You know, Pascal says, like, why doesn't God appear to everyone? Pascal says, because he's a gentleman. In other words, by which he means he doesn't force his company on people who don't want it. And so he thinks it's actually an extraordinary self-transformation that is actually required to desire the thing you desire. Because we so often think so often are mistaken about what we think we want. And he thinks that's the kind of transformation he's looking to work in us.
Thank you. I mean, we're going to have to draw our conversation to a close in a second. I mean, which I'm really disappointed about, because I feel I've barely even got started with my questions. I can see some questions have come through. Feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll turn to them in a sec. So I suppose just to sort of tie it off, first one would be, I was reading this book recently by a Christian monk called David Steindl Rast, who's
Mm,
famous for his work on gratitude, and he's also into the kind of Zen tradition. So he's just sort of sitting at the interfaith intersection, and so he kind of acknowledges the importance of words. So, for example, he realizes that people don't have a taste for the word sin, and so he thinks maybe alienation is a word that people can resonate with more. But he also says, for reasons that we know all too well, that people don't necessarily have a taste for the word God. So perhaps the word meaning could be something that people could connect with. And I think you would want to see meaning as in some way a transcendent phenomenon, not something that is strictly something that can be worked out at a psychological level. But I think he also wants to strip away some of the baggage of thinking of transcendence only in terms of God, a
yeah,
Christian God, etc. I mean,
yeah,
do you see that there are many routes to transcendence, or do you
yeah.
agree with Pascal that it's largely a kind of a theistic route?
Okay. This is a
Sorry, I
terrific.
mean, especially as we're bringing it to
uh,
sort of to an end, it's not an easy question to answer in less than 15 minutes or whatever,
Well,
but
I would. It's a terrific question. It's an important question. let me tell you how this looks to me in the United States right now, which is, as everybody knows, this is a profoundly unsettled moment. And it is a profoundly unsettled moment that touches on language. And that is not an accident. Tocqueville has this wonderful line in which he says, language is the first instrument of thought. And so he notices the words that people tend to use, the words they tend not to use. And so just what you're asking about, meaning versus God, these various terms, anxiety, excuse me, alienation versus sin, these various words that we often use to try to sort of soften down the edges of some vocabulary that we know has troubling implications. I will give you my sense of where things are right now, which is also in accord with my sense of how things are as such, is I think everybody is tired of the evasions. I think people are ready in our moment to talk very frankly about the question of what is highest. It is interesting in the United States, we had this long phenomena of what's called the rise of the nuns, the not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, the people who just checked none on the religious survey that went up and up and up and up and up and finally flattened out, maybe starting to come down. And I think that is reflective of the degree to which people have put a lot of time, a lot of effort. They've bet their lives on something like certain modern visions of happiness. I'll identify you. You've heard my analysis of the Montaignean version of that, and they know it doesn't work. They know it doesn't work because they tried it, and they are interested in what does work. And I think they're ready to be thinking about this in a very frank way. I want to refer here because of the shortness of our time. Somebody wants a more contemporary account of this. One of my colleagues at AEI named Ross Douthat has recently written a book called Believe. Ross is a New York Times columnist, but he's also a Catholic Christian, and it's just a straightforward apologetic. But the interesting thing about it, and this is something that I really agree with him. I'm also a Catholic Christian. I'm a convert. I wasn't raised this way. I just ended up there because I thought it was the most compelling thing. Um, but one of the things that Ross says, which I agree with, and which I think is consistent with a lot of the thinkers that we've been talking about, is like, look, I might think that the God who was born in Nazareth and died on the cross all those years ago is the real incarnation of God. But I didn't get there instantly. I took this weird path through dealing with a lot of Jewish teachers that got me there. The and I don't suppose it's imitable by is everybody else is starting from someplace else. And so maybe for you, the thing that you have to investigate next is Buddhism, and that would not surprise me. The and that's in part because like I don't know what God is up to, and I don't really think anybody does, and that he can lead people to where he wants them to go by very different and complicated paths. That all seems entirely plausible to me. I think the thing from Pascal that it is you can read Pascal for his account of the Christian God in particular, and I hope everyone does because I think that account is true, and because I think he puts it in a very compelling way. But the most important thing that he says to us is man transcends man. You cannot be content with yourself just sitting around drinking coffee and reading the occasional book of philosophy, as much as I love to do those things. You have to seek, and that's what and where that takes you, well, ultimately that's between you and God.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I think it's going to be time. I'll just ask one quick final question before we turn to Q&A. So obviously, in some way, Pascal is a very obscure thinker. Like he writes things like, "I do not know who put me in the world, nor what the world is, nor what I am myself. I am in terrible ignorance about everything. I do not know." Bloody blah blah. Sort of goes on. How's this guy going to help your students with their law school versus PhD thing? Like, how is this move towards transcendence going to actually help with these practical, real world decisions, which Pascal seems almost entirely divorced
Indifferent.
from? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a student asked us, at the end of all this, so which is it, law school or PhD? And we're like, look, dude, I'm trying to show you that there are deeper things than this, that the world is all about. But the student was, of course, in a certain sense, right, that they have to deal with the choices that are right in front of them. This is what our next book is about, and let me say, let me try to give an answer to this question in a couple of sentences. Um, the next book is tentatively called The Art of Choosing, and the standard of choice at which it aims is what Aristotle calls the fitting. That is, Aristotle sees human beings facing the circumstances of their lives and needing to respond to those circumstances, which are often totally uh, sui generis. They don't have precedents, or when they do have precedents, the precedents are always a little off. It's never exactly the same as you're experiencing. And so he says what all of us are seeking to do is to find the fitting response to the situation in which I find myself at this time, in this place, with all these obligations that weigh on me because of my particular ties to family and country and everything else. I've got to find the right order to do things in. I've got to find the right manner to do things in. It's like like these choices are like trying to figure out what to get your mom for her birthday, right? And you want to get just the right thing, the thing that mom will really like, and then you want to give it to her at the right time, and you want to accompany it with just the right words, and all that is quite different from the same question. What should I get somebody for a birthday if the person in question is now my son instead of my mom, right? Um, that is actually life, constantly facing questions like that. And what we're trying to argue in this next book is that you can actually train yourself in part through a liberal education to find the fitting, to seek the just right answer to the particular questions that your life confronts you with. And so, in this sense, law school or PhD, well, for some kids, the answer is law school, and for some kids, the answer is a PhD. And so, and that is, there really is something distinct about the answers that people need to give to these kinds of questions, depending on who they are, when they are, and all the other things that they're facing. But that's not to say that you can't get these questions wrong. All of us know that we get big decisions wrong all the time, and that and so in that sense, saying that the answer might be singular to this or that particular person is not the same thing as saying that there's no that there's no right or wrong in these situations. All of us know when we miss the fitting, right? We give mom the wrong gift. The that is a really common thing, and so that's what we're trying. That's, I think, the best answer we can give with respect to the particular life choices, mundane life choices, law school or PhD, that people face here and now.
Thanks. I mean, you probably know this already, but there's a new book out called The Age of Choice by a
Hmm.
historian called Sophia Rosenfeld. I only know that because she's appearing later in this series in about a month. And yeah, so she's kind of done a big old 500 odd page book called The Age of Choice. And I think it's trying to explore the ways in which the idea of choice became equated with the idea of freedom. So
Yeah.
anyway, let's turn to some questions. Anne Hutchison says, sitting in a room alone for me as a denizen of the 21st century in North America is rather different from sitting alone in a room for Pascal. I don't have his culture or his brilliance. Parisians even stay question why people travel because there is so much available to them locally. Do you care to comment?
On the difference, yeah, sure. If I understand the question rightly, sitting alone in a room is a different phenomena for people in different times and different places with different as the questioner pointed out, with different brains and different backgrounds. Um, I think that's totally true. I think at the same time, if you look at biblical stories and not just biblical stories, lots of really important things happen in deserts because deserts are solitary places, silent places in which one is confronted with these kinds of fundamental questions that we've been talking about today. So, in that sense, it is certainly the case, as the questioner points out, that what it means to sit alone and in silence, you know, like I like to go to churches and sit alone in silence there. And I have to like go through the whole thing of like turning off my cell phone while I'm in the course of this. And like part of the experience is like ceasing to be my own set of calendar reminders, so as to actually have a better thought than that. Um, and that would be different from somebody like Pascal. I think that's entirely true. Nonetheless, the thing that's worth saying about this experience of sitting alone in a room, it sounds terrifying. And at first, when you first sit there with it, I think it is terrifying. But I think when you actually just sit through the boredom for a couple of minutes, it's extraordinarily gratifying. And in that sense, that's another thing that a life lesson we can take from Pascal is do it, do it, go sit alone in rooms. You will be happy. Not you will be happy. That was stupid. You'll be happy you did.
So there's a comment that's just come in from Charles, which I think we could easily make into a interesting question. I mean, this very much taps into the very tension that Montaigne was talking about, is that asking big questions quite often leads to answers that look very authoritarian or fascist. So, I mean, are we
Yeah,
just going to repeat the very same historical pattern that ended with Montaigne kind of trying to bring us down into like 5 or 6 out of 10 instead of 9 or 10 out of 10 in terms of our philosophical or religious intensities?
yeah. The the questioner points to the danger of investigating these kinds of questions, and I think that's totally real. Now, I don't think we're going to repeat the past because the past never repeats. It only rhymes. And so, for example, people like to describe Donald Trump as an authoritarian, and like I just don't think that's quite accurate. Like Donald Trump is an unusual phenomenon. It's like I personally don't really think I understand it yet. I know that I see it very differently than I did, 10 years ago. And so I think it is worth. Yes, there are dangers of involved with politics and the transcendent. That is a real thing. The thing of it, thing that's interesting is there are also dangers involved with politics in the absence of transcendence. It's worth noting that Nazism and Marxism are both atheist ideologies, and they were awfully good at killing people. And so like look, human beings are nuts and terrible, and we do terrible things in the names of all kinds of stuff. And a lot of the cures that we've been prescribing for ourselves are not working. And so, in response to the question, I would say, do we need to make our way forward carefully? Yes. Are we going to be able to simply have recourse to some old formula that is going to save us from ourselves? I don't think so.
Thank you. So I think we're pretty much at time. If anyone else, I mean, there's a comment coming from Wayne. Um, the first 64 years of my life was full of disappointment, but now I'm in perpetual bliss, and that's because of Vedanta Hinduism. So I guess that's a sort of a transcendent
Good
ideal
for
as
him.
well.
The, that's that that's lovely.
Um, so yeah, I guess we'll end with a sort of final question, which I actually heard framed in a podcast interview with Sophia Rosenfeld, and it's something along the lines of, if too much choice is overwhelming, what should the sphere of
Mm.
choice look like?
Yeah, I think that the way that I would challenge that particular framing of the question is that we just don't really have any control over the what the sphere of choice is. What we do, what we are faced with every single day is getting up and making an awful lot of choices. And in that sense, the book that you mentioned earlier, and I didn't know about that, and I'm very happy to learn of it. The sense that our age has in some ways over celebrated choice. I think there's something true to that, and that's not when we talk about the art of choosing. We are not doing that as a way of just saying choice is wonderful. Isn't it great? We have so many choices and so on and so forth. Actually, we're doing it from, in a certain sense, in the opposite direction, in the sense that choice is inevitable. And what we need to do is get better at making it. So it is not so painful to us, particularly because choice is like just a perpetual bombardment that we are facing every day. And so we hope that some of the things that we're working on can be useful to people in thinking through the fact that they do have choices. They inevitably have choices. They need to make them, and ultimately they can take some satisfaction in making at least some of them well. Not all of them. Most, we're all going to make mistakes, but at least some of them.